Hey everybody, welcome back to Final Trade. I've been playing this old vintage era red Sligh deck a lot in the last several months since I made the first video about it. And probably about 40, 50, 60 games, something like that. Mostly against similar vintage era black aggro decks, white weenie decks, senior stompy decks, that kind of thing. So, kind of classic aggro on aggro matchups. And I wanted to talk today about kind of some of the changes that I've made to it, some of the things I've learned, and some of the thoughts I have, and some of the things that kind of confuse me that I'm trying to develop with my deck building and game playing overall. So you'll see a lot of these things are the same. It's kind of minor changes that I made, about 10 cards out of the 60. So I still have the four Jackal Pups, of course, the four Mog Fanatics, the four Ball Lightnings, four Fire Slingers. The two Mog Flunkies are original also, and so is the Goblin Vandal, and I'll have something to say about them as I go on. Of course, Lightning Bolts and Fire Blast and Curse Scroll are all normal. Now, what I've changed is I've added the four Incinerates, the four Goblin Patrols, and I added a second Final Fortune, and I have a lot of thoughts about that. Mainly the reason that I added these Goblin Patrols, and these are great. Another 1 mana 2/1. You have to pay the casting cost again the next turn, but that's not a big deal really. I mean, this is really a shallow mana curve deck. And I'll show you what I took out to make room for this. So first of the things I took out, I had at one time I had four lava hounds in here, and then I took it down to two, and now I've taken it down to zero. And the problem with these is at 4 mana, they're really just too expensive for this deck. This deck is, again, it's such a shallow mana curve. You're trying to kind of burst to the end with a win about turn four, maybe turn five. And so something like this that comes out on turn four, and yeah, it's unaffected by summoning sickness, but it's going to suck up all your mana on turn four to deal 4 damage. And if the game runs longer, it can be more efficient. But the other thing is, your opponent can just throw anything in front of it just to stop it and slow it down. Maybe their defender will die, but not a big deal to them depending on how the game is going. And what I found was I just wasn't getting to play this card very often. I would draw it, and then I just wouldn't be able to put it down and utilize it very well. The second thing that I took out was two wrathy dragons that I had, and this was kind of the same problem, only worse, because even though it has flying and it's a 5/5 compared to this 4/4 grounder, um, the wrathy dragon has summoning sickness. So best case, you put it out on turn four. It attacks on turn five. So on turn five, this card deals 5 damage. So you're only getting a payback of 1 damage per turn for the first 5 turns for having this card in your deck. And it was another one just like the Lava Hounds where I just didn't get to play it very often. I would just hold it in my hand the whole game, and the game would end, whether I would win or lose, and the game would end, and I would still have this in my hand. And so it just wasn't useful. Um, so I took those four out, and those were the highest casting cost cards in the deck. There was nothing over 4 mana in the deck. Fire Blast. Nominally, its casting cost is 6, but you never cast it with mana. You cast it by sacrificing mountains. That's the whole point. So what else did I take out of the deck? 3 copies of Orcish Artillery, which was all I had in there. And this is another one. If I get to turn 3, I'd much rather play a Ball Lightning than an Orcish Artillery. And if I have the option, I was playing the Ball Lightning every time, not the Orcish Artillery. It has the nice ability to go over your opponent's head and just attack him directly, not get hung up on his defenders. But again, it was just difficult to feel like I was getting good utilization out of this. And again, this is a deck that tries to surge and win about the fourth or fifth turn. So if you put this out on turn three, then on your opponent's next turn, there's no more summoning sickness, and you can activate the ability. But I replace it with, say, Incinerate or another Final Fortune or these Goblin Patrols, which were the 9 cards I put into the deck. And I feel like all of these things are much faster. The Final Fortune's its own thing I'll get to, but the Incinerate and the Goblin Patrol I feel like are just faster cards. They're cheaper overall. I took out of the deck a bunch of cards that had 3 and 4 casting cost and replaced them with cards that had 1 and 2 casting cost. So I made that mana curve even more shallow for the deck. And the last thing that I took out of the deck, because I've only shown you the 2 lava hounds, the 2 wrathy dragons, and the 3 orcish artilleries, is I had 2 copies of bloodlust in there, and this was always kind of an iffy card. I felt like I was experimenting with this, seeing if it was good enough, seeing if it was interesting to put in here. It's 2 damage per mana on this card, but really the problem with it is you had to be in a situation where your attacker got through to the opponent. And you can't rely on that 100%. You can rely on it pretty well in this deck because there's so many small swarmy creatures. But there would be times when I would have, say, fire slingers and orcish artillery out. Maybe I had Mog flunkies, but there were defenders, and so, I didn't want to attack because of just the situation on the board. And then I might be holding this card and it would be useless in my hand. And, I may be waiting one more turn to just get up the mana to curse scroll again or play a lightning bolt and then throw down a fire blast and win the game. And it was another one of these issues where I found I was holding this card the whole game, and there were just a lot of places against other aggressive aggro decks where I just couldn't utilize this card very well. And so I took it out. And like I said, I put in the Incinerates and the Goblin Patrols. And the Incinerates, it's a far cry from Lightning Bolt. I would much rather there was just a second version of Lightning Bolt that was 1 mana at instant speed. I know there are a couple in the Vintage era that are 1 mana, 3 damage to a creature or player, but they're at sorcery speed. Maybe I'll think about those eventually, but there's a lot of advantages to having these at instant speed. And I know, I've kind of thought about Incinerate versus Shock. You get 1 less damage, but it costs 1 less mana. I know there's another version out there. It's called Firebolt, and I think it's from Odyssey. And it's 2 damage for 1 mana, and it has one of those replay abilities where you can pay like 5 mana to play it again from your graveyard and remove it from the game. But it plays at sorcery speed, which is, unacceptable. And the replay ability, it's just way too much mana for a deck with this kind of shallow mana curve. But Shock is something that I'm definitely going to keep in mind as I go forward playing this modified deck and think, when I have an Incinerate in my hand, what if it were a Shock? And I think that's kind of a useful skill when you're trying to build decks and you're thinking about what could I do? Just make a mental note of 1 or 2 substitutions that you might like to make. And every time you look at a hand, every time you're in a game and you think about it, think, well, what if I had that card right now? Would it be more useful or less useful? And another substitution that I've really thought a lot about, one that I think is much easier to make, is getting rid of the Goblin Vandal and trading them for Shattering Pulse. And, you had the old Shatter card, which was the same mana cost too, and it was instant speed also, and it was destroy an artifact, but now this one just has, hey, it's got a buyback ability. So the problem with Goblin Vandal, 1, there's only a single one of them in the deck, and he has to get through to the opponent to actually activate his ability, and, it just doesn't come up that often that it's very useful. And so I feel like directly taking an artifact out with Shattering Pulse would be a lot more useful if we're still only talking about 1 copy of either one of them in the deck. So this is a substitution I'm much more likely to make soon. I'm going to play this deck a lot more first and really think about it. And same thing, when the Goblin Vandal's in my hand, I'll think, well, what if I had Shattering Pulse instead? Now, the Mog flunkies, I've never been enamored with them. But, they're kind of a staple of these old Vintage era Sligh decks. And I think with how I've changed this deck around, lowering the average cost of the creature cards in the deck, I think that these will be a lot more useful than they have in the past. So I'm expecting these to be a better card going forward in this deck. And so that brings us to the last thing, Final Fortune. I don't know, maybe I'm the one missing something, but I don't understand why when I go out and I look at old, pre-modern tournament format Sligh decks or vintage era Magic Sligh decks, you don't see Final Fortune in there. And I think this is an amazing card. When you're playing a turn-based game, what's more valuable than an extra turn? And this came out in Mirage originally, and I was thinking about it earlier today before I started filming, and I thought, there was that old card Relentless Assault that came out in Visions, and it was a red sorcery, and it was 4 mana, and it gave you a second attack phase during your turn. And you got to untap all your creatures and attack again. And it's like, this is only 2 mana, and it basically does the same thing, except you get to untap everything, and you get to draw again, and you get the whole extra turn. Now, sure, you lose the game at the end of it, but remember, this is a deck that tries to surge and win on the 4th or 5th turn no matter what. And so, initially I had 1 copy of Final Fortune in this deck, and I thought, it just doesn't get drawn enough. And I was kind of under this illusion that, there is no time you can ever play a second copy of this effectively. There are nuanced edge cases where you can, but not effectively, not commonly, and not against an average deck. But just having the second copy in there will increase the chance of you drawing it often enough and giving you enough extra marginal wins that it's probably worth it for the rare time when you draw both copies of these in one game. And so this is one of those kind of fundamental deck building ideas. It's that if you have a card like this where you can only ever play one of them, it can still be worthwhile to have multiple copies of it in the deck because it increases the chance of you drawing it. And even if you draw both and it just rots in your hand the entire game, that will only happen rarely compared to the additional number of times that second copy helps you draw one of them and you win the game because of it. And so that's one of those kind of fundamental deck building ideas that I kind of struggle with and I think about a lot, and I'm kind of looking for a consistent way to think about that so that I have more clarity on it and that I can get better at building decks. I'm still playing just 19 regular mountains. I actually saw something recently, and it was using old original fetch lands, and so it had the red-green fetch land and the red-black fetch land, and it was still just a mono-red deck, but it used them to thin out land from the deck. And I thought that was a really good idea. I don't have any of those old fetch lands yet. And I think they're rather expensive too. So I'll see about getting some of those in the future. But let me know if there are any other great cards from the vintage era. I love all of these old frame cards. It kind of unofficially is known also as the pre-modern tournament format, which is unofficial to Wizards of the Coast. So if there's other great Sligh cards from that era that I'm missing, leave them in the comments. Let me know what you think about this. I'm going to go back and play this some more against, Black Aggro, White Weenie, Senior Stompy, those kind of interesting matchups, and see how it does with these changes. If you like this kind of thing and you like old, beautiful, vintage Magic cards, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade. Thanks a lot.